first in our webinar series for GW Shift. I'm the Deputy Director for GW Shift, which is all about building the economic activity in hydrogen across the South West England and South Wales. We are recording today so that this will be available to others who haven't been able to join us. And we will also be sharing Professor Tim May's slides after the event, along with a feedback form, which would be great to get your feedback. This is the first of our events, these seminars for GW Shift. And so both of those will be available after our presentation today. We will have time at the end for some Q&A. So if you've got any questions as Professor May is talking, then please put them in the chat and we will make sure that we get Tim to answer those. And if we can't do them all, we'll make sure that we can get some insights afterwards from Tim and put them, send them to you all afterwards. So without further ado, it is my great delight and joy to invite Professor Tim Mays for this first session that we are doing in a series of seminars which you can sign up to. So I will hand over to Tim Mays.
Karen, can you see the slide?
Yes.
Excellent.
Ready to go.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me just move on. My name's Tim Mays. I'm Professor of Chemical and Materials Engineering at the University of Bath, and I'm co-director of the GW Shift programme, together with my colleague Professor Xiaohong Li at the University of Exeter, and we're working very closely with Karen Brooks, who introduced me today as Deputy Director. So thank you, Karen, for your kind introduction. I give various talks in this space, and some of the titles today is Hydrogen 101. It has been hydrogen, number one element, number one fuel. It has been the only way is hydrogen. And sometimes I've nicked an idea from a colleague of mine, the unbearable lightness of hydrogen. This is an idea that Nuno Bimbo at Southampton came up with, thanks to Milan Kundera. So these are some of the titles you may have seen in the past. So forgive me if some of this is something you've seen before. So I'm not intending to give a detailed manifesto or analysis today. It's more of an introduction to the broad and interesting area of hydrogen, in particular to achieve net zero and energy security. The overarching motivation for the work that I do, and many of us do, is sustainable development. The idea that we should meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the current needs we're thinking of are illustrated on the top right here: water, power, heating, food, chemicals. We shouldn't forget things like pharmaceuticals are part of our needs and to keep us going. And so the idea is that we really need to make sure we meet these needs now and in the future. The framing of a lot of sustainable development is by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them here. There's a significant overlap amongst them, but the main ones that I'm interested in and will concentrate on today are affordable and clean energy and climate action. But actually, I would say there's a lot of interaction and engagement across all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So the context of this is that there are more and richer people over the world, demanding more and more energy and related services. And as a result, mainly by CO2 emissions to air from using fossil fuels, the CO2 emissions are increasing. On the top graph, the graph at the top right indicates the increase in carbon dioxide emissions over the last couple of hundred years. And the most recent figure is 428 parts per million a few days ago. And at the bottom, there's a graph of the world global mean temperature over the similar period, and you can see very clearly there's a correlation there. It doesn't mean that they're initially that they're connected, but in fact, the science consensus is that the reason why the global mean temperature is increasing is because of increasing carbon dioxide concentration and other effects such as deforestation. And the thesis I have is that hydrogen can help us mitigate and maybe adapt to these challenges that we face as a result of global mean temperature increases. And this is a brilliant visualization of the increasing temperatures over the last couple of hundred years, down to Ed Hawkins at Reading. And the yellow, the white stripes are the average over this whole period. Blue is cooler, red is warmer, and really you don't need to say anything about this. Clearly, the global mean temperatures are increasing, especially over the last few decades. Recognizing this, the COP21 meeting in Paris in 2015, so nearly 10 years ago now, identified this issue and clarified it and came up with some ideas that they should reduce emissions to limit global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and preferably below 1 degrees, 1.5 degrees, and that there should be global initiatives in order to achieve this objective. Unfortunately, we seem to have missed the boat a little bit because last year the average temperature was 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial averages. To be fair, the Paris Agreement looks at a long-term trend rather than individual years, but we do appear to be struggling a little bit here. Going back to the UK, in 2008, the UK established one of the first net zero, excuse me, carbon dioxide emissions targets in the UK in the world, and it was to reduce emissions relative to 1990 to 80% of their emissions in 1990 by 2050. Later, after a lot of discussion, this was recognised not to be enough, and that the 2019 amendment said that by 2050 we would be net zero. That is, the net emission of CO2 to the atmosphere would be zero. And over the last 4 or 5 years, including via the previous government, there have been significant initiatives in the UK to achieve this objective. And most recently, last year, the Great British Energy concept by the new Labour government has indicated how it intends to implement and work towards these net zero targets. The net zero targets are managed according to things called carbon budgets, which are the amount of carbon dioxide, which is on the left axis, against time on the bottom axis. What this is really a journey to achieving net zero in 2050, and it looks like we're actually on target. We're sort of midway through now. However, I would say that it was perhaps easy pickings earlier on to get rid of things like coal, and there was deindustrialization. So we're actually entering a period now, carbon budget 4 and 5 and 6, where we're going to really have to work very, very hard to make sure we keep on track. Now, the previous government came up with a 10-point plan in order to help us manage our net zero targets. Some of them are here. I'll come back to them later probably, but the one I'm interested in is hydrogen, point 2 on this 10-point plan. And today, really, I'm illustrating the benefits and some of the challenges faced with this point 2, driving the growth of low carbon hydrogen. And why do we do it? The most recent British Energy initiative from the government, part of its mission statements about how it intends to manage our economy, hydrogen has been recognised one of the major investment opportunities, public and private, in order to help us achieve net zero targets and energy security as well. So hydrogen is very much in the current government's plans. And in fact, the other day, Rachel Reeves reminded us in her post her interview on radio that hydrogen is part of the mix. So, what is it about hydrogen? Why are we interested? Well, I've tried to capture that in this single slide, but I'm going to elaborate as I move through. On the left, we've got lots of energy options: heat, electricity. I'll use my cursor if you can see that. Light or radiation. What you can do is split water. What that means is you can break H2O, water, into its component elements, hydrogen and oxygen. You can store the hydrogen for a later time and certainly move it around, and then deliver the energy back by combining hydrogen and oxygen to make water and heat or electricity, or probably both. So the idea of hydrogen, it's more of an energy carrier. It moves energy around or keeps hydrogen safe for later use. There's lots of potential energy in, you get a lot of energy out, and the only material product is water, which of course is relatively benign. And the idea is that actually molecules, including hydrogen, are easier to store in principle than electrons in a battery. And on the right, it shows that we can use the hydrogen or maybe other compounds containing hydrogen for power, for heating, for transport, and in the industrial sector. So this is a bit cheesy, but storing molecules in a tank on the left, if I close the regulator off and I go away and I come back, the hydrogen's still there. I can't always say the same for electrons in a battery. So while batteries have their place, there are issues with charging and storing and discharging that you don't have so much with containing molecules. So my first claim is that in principle, hydrogen, or any molecule in fact, but hydrogen is sort of easier to store in principle than electrons. So hydrogen in the periodic table, it's no doubt it is the number one element on the top left. And the periodic table goes up to a element number 118, organesson. Most of the universe is made of hydrogen. And so far as anyone knows, only 5 atoms of organesson have ever been made. So that gives the kind of scale of how much of these elements are in the periodic table. I never fail to get excited when I look at the periodic table. So how has hydrogen entered our lives? Well, the key to me was Henry Cavendish in 1766, who identified hydrogen as an independent element. He didn't call it anything. Lavoisier called it hydrogen later on. But Cavendish identified hydrogen as an independent element as breaking down water. And subsequently, hydrogen has started to enter into our culture and our technology. For example, the first internal combustion engine in 1804 in Switzerland was by de Rivas. No, not many people know this. So the first internal combustion engine was powered by hydrogen. And later on, town gas or coal gas was used by treating coal to produce gases such as methane and hydrogen, and then pumping these into people's houses and using them for cooking and heating and also for lighting. A messy, difficult process, and also put carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide into people's houses was not a wise move. But town and coal gas, 50% of town gas was hydrogen. So we were pumping hydrogen to people's houses up until the late 60s and 70s. But natural gas came along and displaced town gas, and all the gas cylinders around people's towns and cities disappeared. So hydrogen is also used to make ammonia and hence fertilizer. And I would say without fertilizer, ammonia fertilizer based fertilizers, crop yields would be a half or less than what they are now. So without hydrogen, we wouldn't have the crop yields that we have now. A remarkable statement, really. So hydrogen is so important. Unfortunately, the Hindenburg doesn't help with perception of hydrogen. But hydrogen is used a lot in oil processing. Of course, it's the elements of the hydrogen bomb. It was also used for many years in the shuttle. The big brown tank in the middle, the external tank, had 100 tons of hydrogen on it. And at the bottom right there, there's me laughing my head off in a Toyota Mirai 2, and I drove around Windsor Great Park having a wonderful time in a quiet car, only producing water at the tailpipe. There is hydrogen in culture. There's a dreadful book called Mysterious Island by Jules Verne, but there's a bit in it that's quite interesting. Water decomposed into its primitive elements, he says, could be a competitor for electricity. So he was actually piggybacking on lots of other science people there, and it was made into a couple of dreadful films as well. Led Zeppelin 1, there's the Hindenburg there. You may remember from Quantum of Solace, the James Bond film, there was a lot of there was a fuel cells blowing up in the middle of a desert. I'm not sure why. And more recently, Oppenheimer about the H bomb. So hydrogen has sort of crept into our culture. Let's get back to science. Now, hydrogen is the simplest atom in the universe. It's got a proton in the middle and an electron whizzing around it, rather like a little mini solar system. And the size of the hydrogen atom is a quarter of a billionth of a meter across. It's almost not there. You don't get much atomic hydrogen around. More likely, it's dihydrogen or molecular hydrogen, where two hydrogens sort of join together and share their electrons at the bottom. This, in fact, is a simplification of more complex and sophisticated models based on quantum theory. But I can't help but always visualize atoms as little solar systems. So I'll continue along that vein today. coincidentally and completely by accident, the symbol for hydrogen that John Dalton produced in his atomic theory in 1808 looks exactly like the model we have of the hydrogen atom now, but that was pure coincidence. Of course, nothing's ever quite as simple as it seems. You can have so-called radioisotopes or nuclear isotopes of hydrogen. The one on the left is the one we recognize. The one in the middle there, deuterium, has one extra neutron, and tritium, which is radioactive, has two extra neutrons. So these mean that we can have a variety of different compounds containing these nuclear isotopes. And on the right, when you have molecular hydrogen, the protons in the middle of the hydrogen atoms can either spin in parallel at the bottom or here, or anti-parallel here. And these are called ortho and para-hydrogen. And if I went to the shop and bought a cylinder of hydrogen, it would have about 25% para, 25% of this, and about 75% of that. And that's called normal hydrogen. I won't spend much more time on this, but it will be in my slide deck if ever one people have a look at it. Nuclear fusion runs the universe. So here we have deuterium and tritium combining to form huge amounts of energy, and that's what drives the stars and the sun. And we're attempting to replicate that on Earth. And in the UK, where there are scaled up fusion reactors being designed and constructed, and one of them is going to be in West Burton in Nottinghamshire. And hydrogen has a rich and interesting chemistry. At the top left, there's the hydrogen bond. And what that means is in water, the oxygen atom is very slightly negative and the hydrogen atom slightly positive, and they attract each other, positive and negative. And without the hydrogen bond, water wouldn't exist as a liquid in the conditions that we live on Earth, and we wouldn't be here. So hydrogen very much is the substance of life. Of course, there's a rich chemistry of hydrocarbons, um, oil and gas and coal and other things like that. Um, on the bottom right, there's carbohydrates. This is glucose, the sugars. We are made of sugars. So hydrogen is literally a part of our life. And also hydrogen can exist in ionic form. That's it can gain or lose an electron and can have different chemistries based on whether it's ionic or not. So hydrogen is the most commonest element in the universe. And here's my artist's impression of the Big Bang in the middle there, 14 billion years ago. And it's still the most common element in the universe in stars and galaxies. And the middle picture there's the beautiful Andromeda galaxy. It's also common on Earth, but not free hydrogen. It's or is there? We'll mention that in a minute. But mostly hydrogen is contained in water, in biomass, and the sugars in biomass or in fossil fuels. So in fact, there is a lot of hydrogen around, but mostly it's contained in chemicals. That is until recently there was a discovery which may turn out to be very significant of naturally occurring hydrogen. And what that means is hydrogen has seeped into from the depths, geological depths, to the Earth's surface. And if I just illustrate how the theory is how this is made, very deep down, it's highly radioactive, and that's what keeps the crust warm. And that radioactivity can split water to form hydrogen, which then sort of trickles up to the surface. This is so-called white hydrogen or naturally occurring hydrogen, and that may be something to keep an eye on for the future. This has been detected in sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world, so a very interesting development. So some key facts. Well, it's a fairly innocuous gas. Generally, it's odorless, tasteless. You wouldn't know it was there. It does combine with water, oxygen to produce a lot of energy. We'll come on to that in a minute. It's very, very low density. If I highlight here, it's less than the 10% of the density of air. It's less than the liquid hydrogen, which is astonishing low temperature. That's the boiling point of hydrogen, minus 253 degrees Celsius. Liquid hydrogen, excuse me, is less than 10% of the density of liquid water, and even solid hydrogen is less than 10% of the density of solid ice. And if I had a bucket of liquid hydrogen, you wouldn't know it was there. It's less than a kilogram, and you wouldn't know it's there. It's remarkable low density. But the key is, for me, that 1 kilogram of hydrogen contains about the same energy as 3 kilograms of petrol or diesel or gasoline or natural gas. So while it's got a low density, it's got a very high energy per unit mass, with so-called specific energy density. And this is one of the keys for using hydrogen. You don't need much of it to generate a lot of energy. However, it's expensive at the moment. There isn't the infrastructure there out there to reduce the cost, and it's still much more expensive than the methane that is generally used to make it. So there are challenges there. I won't spend much time on this, except to say this is a diagram of what the different states of hydrogen can be under different conditions. And the key here, this across here is 1 atmosphere where we live in our real world. And you can see the astonishingly low temperatures we have to get of liquids or solids. And the key message here, low temperatures. When we combine hydrogen and oxygen as a chemical reaction, we form water as the only material product and a lot of energy. And that energy generated is 3 or 4 times more than the energy generated by hydrocarbons, for example. And there's no carbon dioxide, at least when we oxidize hydrogen. So this is a remarkable element, is that most of the products are interesting and useful and benign. So again, another incentive to look at hydrogen closely in our energy system. But what about hydrogen now? Well, there's about 100 million tons of hydrogen made a year, and way less than natural gas. And it's mainly produced by combining steam and natural gas. So the main method is not very sustainable, produces a lot of carbon dioxide. But nevertheless, that's still the method now used to make hydrogen. And what do you use it for? Mainly to make ammonia, and that goes on to make chemicals like fertilizers. It's also used in petroleum refining. It's used in methanol, which then goes on to make lots of different interesting chemicals, and not much else is used. It's certainly not used much in the energy industries yet. So in other words, at the moment, hydrogen still has a lot of headway to make into being used, but we'll come on to that as I move through. So what about the hydrogen happening next? What's going to happen next? Well, we've got a lot of options of energy input, and what we want to do is generally split water, or we may be able to generate hydrogen from biomass, but we may need to capture the carbon dioxide. So this bit here is capturing carbon dioxide. So we may put energy in, we generate hydrogen, we move it around in pipelines or maybe in tube trailers, or we can put it into the gas grid. I'll come on to that in a minute. And we can use it later on or someplace else to generate power, use it in industry. And again, I'll mention that in a minute. We can use it for heating in buildings, and we can use it in transport. So it really is a flexible Swiss Army knife of energy. The previous government generated the hydrogen strategy about all the kinds of things we need to think about to develop the hydrogen technology in the UK. And if anyone's interested, that it's readily online on the government web pages. And the plans for the government, which still are active there, is generating huge amounts of jobs by new tech, a lot of private investment, and more significantly reducing emissions significantly as a result of using renewable electricity to generate hydrogen and then use that hydrogen later on. There are targets for the amount of hydrogen to be produced. And at the bottom, that's 10 gigawatts. That doesn't say much. It's about 5 or 6 times more hydrogen than we currently make. And there are milestones where we're slipping a little bit, to be honest. But there are government targets about how we should start to bring in the hydrogen economy and move away from fossil fuels. There are also models that indicate generating huge amounts of job, lots of gross value added to the UK economy, significant 23 billion. It's not a significant amount, maybe more. So there are lots of economic benefits that could be generated as a result of new technology, in addition to reducing carbon emissions, which, of course, as I said at the beginning, is very important. So if you want to make hydrogen, at the moment, it's mostly by treating natural gas with steam. Unfortunately, it does generate carbon dioxide, so you really should capture the carbon if you can, excuse me. But the future is likely to become from renewable energy, solar or biomass or solar PV, photovoltaic or wind or geothermal. and that can generate water by electrolysis, generate hydrogen from water electrolysis, or it can split water directly using solar catalysis. So there are lots of methods to make it. Unfortunately, at the moment, the main method here, and there are increasing interest in using renewable electricity to renewable sources to generate hydrogen. Now, you may have heard of hydrogen colors: green, blue, black, grey, whatever. The the hydrogen I'm interested in is green hydrogen at the bottom, by using renewable electricity to split water by electrolysis to generate hydrogen. Blue hydrogen is the current method, but if we capture the carbon dioxide, and unfortunately, a lot of the hydrogen we make now is grey hydrogen, which means we do release CO2. And I've already mentioned naturally occurring hydrogen, sometimes called gold hydrogen after the gold rush. And that may be a real significant find for the future. And there are other colours here. So these are the what's creeping into the current vernacular about hydrogen. Um, if you look at what can move energy around, you can think of it in terms of energy density and amount of energy per unit mass and amount of energy per unit volume. And these are all the different technologies you can use. And you can see straight away that hydrogen produces a huge amount of energy per unit mass, but at the moment, per unit volume, it's not great. So what we want to do is to move hydrogen further up this curve here in order to reduce the volume that we need to store hydrogen. So storage can be done in two different ways. One is by generating hydrogen gas, say from electrolysis of water, and generating liquid or solid hydrogen, that's at very low temperatures, compressing hydrogen at very high pressures, or containing hydrogen in these fancy porous materials that I've illustrated here, where hydrogen can be stored in these gaps. And this is an area that I'm particularly interested in, and I know some people on the attending today are interested. And we can also store hydrogen molecule H2 underground, or by introducing it into the gas grid, and I'll mention that in a minute. You can also, if you like, recombine the hydrogen to form chemical compounds that are easier to move around. For example, ammonia. So this is ammonia, and you can use these so-called carriers, and you can need to move around hydrogen and then get the hydrogen back out again later on, and that's called chemical storage. So there are different methodologies, different approaches to store the hydrogen. So if I wanted to drive a car about 300 miles or 500 kilometers, this is how much hydrogen I need by volume, just under ambient conditions. Well, that's not going to happen. You're going to have to reduce the volume if you're going to use it, say, in transport. So some of the options are on the diagram here: compressed gas on the right, 10,000 psi, that's 300, more than 300 times the pressure in your car tire. And at the bottom is liquid hydrogen at minus 253 degrees Celsius. So the conditions required to increase the density of hydrogen and reduce its volume are in themselves challenging. But of course, the argument is that once you contain them and do it properly, then you're going to have the hydrogen for a rainy day later on. You can move hydrogen around in tube trailers at the top, in red cylinders, which often you see in laboratories, or liquid hydrogen here. So there are, if you want to move hydrogen around, there are sort of conventional freight routes to do that. I mentioned ammonia. One way of moving hydrogen around is to generate a hydrogen, react it with something, for example, nitrogen from air, and forming ammonia, use the ammonia as a carrier to move it around and store and distribute it, excuse me, and then get the hydrogen back out again by breaking down ammonia. So this is an example of what's called a carrier, and this is another way of managing the hydrogen economy. Um, um, the advantage is that these carriers may be easier to move around, but the disadvantage is you need to put a fair amount of energy in to get the hydrogen back out again, so it doesn't come at zero cost. An interesting option is introducing renewable or green hydrogen from wind power, for example, electrolyzing water and feeding that directly into the gas grid. The gas grid is a big thing. There's a lot of piping around, and 80% of the population is connected to the natural gas grid. So we could start to decarbonize the gas grid by putting green hydrogen into it and blend. This is called blending. and this is a very big, a significant option for integrating hydrogen into our energy system. We can put 20% hydrogen in and not worry so much about how it affects our gas boiler or other downstream instruments. Um, but at the moment, there's still some discussion had to be had on the safety case to approve this process. My feeling is that we could get 20% in no problem, and maybe one day 100% and completely displace natural gas. Geological storage is also interesting for seasonal or even annual or decadal storage, where you generate the hydrogen, green hydrogen from a wind turbine offshore, perhaps, pump the hydrogen down into a depleted gas field or some other geological formation, and then access the hydrogen later on to enter into the pipe networks or transported around. So geological storage is seen as a significant option, both onshore and offshore. So what can you do with the hydrogen? Well, you can burn it in the way we're familiar with combusting natural gas, and we can either burn it in a gas turbine to generate power or for propulsion, or we can also introduce hydrogen into an internal combustion engine in the same way we do with diesel or gasoline, and that can produce transport, helpful in transport, or it can be used in a generator to generate power. So hydrogen can be used in a sort of familiar kind of ways. A lot of flame burners in the ceramics industry use natural gas burners. They use a lot of natural gas and therefore produce a lot of CO2. Excuse me. And we can replace that with hydrogen. There's a lot of interest in the ceramics industry to move away from natural gas burners, and we can use it in our homes and businesses in hydrogen boilers, either in blended boilers with natural gas or fully hydrogen boilers. If you had a fully hydrogen heating system, you would have to have a new boiler. You can't retrofit a current natural gas boiler. There needs to be some management of the cost implications of that for the consumer, but nevertheless, that could generate a lot of new jobs and skills to replace gas boilers. And of course, there was a lot of gas boiler replacements when we went from town gas to natural gas. So this is by burning hydrogen. We can also generate electricity by combining hydrogen and oxygen. I won't go through the details at the top, but essentially we're feeding oxygen and hydrogen water into a system where the water is split electrochemically. So essentially having electrons generated by combining oxygen and hydrogen rather than burning it to make heat. And then electrons are a current and they can do all sorts of interesting things, just like electrons can do in our lives. We're familiar with them. So there are different types of these so-called fuel cells, and they're a very, very interesting option. There are challenges in terms of the materials used in the fuel cells and their lifetimes. Nevertheless, they are an interesting and important option for, if you like, harvesting the energy from hydrogen. So I mentioned about some of the applications. Hydrogen, we know that in the UK, the blast furnaces for making smelting iron have been closed down, but later on, if we're going to revitalise the iron and steel industry in the UK, we can replace those blast furnaces by reducing iron ore to iron metal, which then goes on to make steel by using hydrogen. It essentially reduces or strips the oxygen out of the metal ore. I mentioned about heating in cement and glass manufacture, the kilns and the high temperature flame burners in ceramic manufacture do produce a lot of CO2. And there's a lot of interest in companies to reduce their carbon footprint by using hydrogen for their flame burners in kilns rather than natural gas. And as a chemical engineer, I'm interested in hydrogen also being used to make chemicals, to replace chemicals made by fossil fuels. Ammonia is probably the most important one to go on to make fertilizer, but you can also use hydrogen to make synthetic aircraft fuel, so-called sustainable aviation fuel, and also other chemicals in to replace the chemicals made by oil. So not all oil processing goes to make fuel. A lot of oil processing goes to make chemicals, and again into the pharmaceutical industry is another option. And I mentioned that we produce oxygen if we split water. H2O goes to hydrogen and water and oxygen. Um, the oxygen can also be used to do things. And this is an example of wastewater treatment using oxygen, and it can also be used in the healthcare industry. A lot of us, I'm a consumer, I'm a voter, I'm interested in how much power and heating costs me, and we need to make sure that the lights stay on. So, but at the moment, hydrogen energy systems are expensive. But in 2006, the Stern Review commissioned or made a very significant claim that without investing in renewable economies, the amount of money we would need put in, 1% of our gross domestic product, would be set against a 20% reduction in the GDP if we did nothing. And this is not often built into business models. So, in other words, by not doing anything, we could have a massive hit on our GDP, which is currently about 2.3 trillion per annum. So, in other words, while new tech can always be expensive, photovoltaics were expensive, but the price comes down as we start to integrate the technology into our economies. Safety. We do need to manage concentrated energy safely. All concentrated energy needs to be managed safely. Electricity, natural gas, petrol and diesel, uranium, they're all concentrated energy sources, as you might say, and so is hydrogen. So the concept that hydrogen somehow has a different kind of safety consideration, all concentrated energy needs to be managed very carefully. No doubt there are issues related to specific issues related to hydrogen. I won't go through all the details here, but a number of them I'd like to highlight. Here, for example, we have a lot of energy. We have a very wide range of concentrations of hydrogen will be flammable. This is much more than the ranges for natural gas or gasoline. So we do have to be conscious that hydrogen has a very wide flammable range, so-called flammable range. It doesn't take much energy to ignite it. And also, if it leaks through a valve or a vent, it can warm up rather than cool down, which is the diagram on the right. I won't go into any details, but what that means is there are wide range of conditions where hydrogen will heat up when it leaks, and that could lead to ignition. But the chemicals industry has been using hydrogen safely for many, many years, quite perfectly safely. So, albeit within the boundaries of an industrial plant, and we're working now very hard to transfer the regulations and codes and standards so they can be adapted for new use more in the public domain. Now, the consumer, the voter, will be the ultimate deciding community about how and whether and where and when new tech is taken up. So a lot of the population, let's think about the UK in particular, are aware of energy and climate change. Less so with hydrogen, except and this includes policymakers. And if you do think of hydrogen, a lot of people, they think of it in the negative sense, the Hindenburg, the H-bomb, and generally in terms of danger, which is a shame, really, considering all the options we have with hydrogen. There are some areas in the UK where they're quite happy with hydrogen, where there's a lot of hydrogen used and part of the employment cycle in Teesside and South Wales. But what we need to make sure that we have all the information up to date and accessible and accurate to inform the public, if there is such a thing, consumers, voters, policymakers, to reassure them that things are being managed safely. We are aware of the safety issues related to hydrogen, and we can deal with them. We know how to do that. And there is this concept of myth busting that hydrogen is somehow lethal, which it isn't. On top of this, we also need education, training, and skills to support new technology, and of course, a university. This is high on my priority list. So, looking at the time, I think what I wanted to do is to give plenty of time for people to ask questions. So, I'll wrap up, and I'm very happy to pick up any questions after I finish. So the 10-point plan, and again, this was delivered by the previous government, but it still applies now, and these are the sort of focus areas. And hydrogen definitely has a role in delivering, what I've been talking about in meeting point two, but it also has a role in offshore wind, for example, using offshore wind to generate hydrogen from water electrolysis. It can be used to generate hydrogen from nuclear power. It can be used on in low carbon vehicles, on public transport, in aircraft and ships to help heat buildings, and can be allied with carbon capture and storage in order to generate new chemicals. I'm not clear so much on the impacts on our natural environment, but of course, one of the um, challenges we face are not only provision of safe and secure energy, but also the impact of climate change on biodiversity. So this we need to understand how all these new tech will influence the natural environment. And at the moment, the business models for hydrogen are being developed, taxation and insurance and things like that. So that's something that needs to be resolved and delivered in the future. This is my little wrapper, but it does kind of give some historical perspective on what chemical fuels we've used over the centuries. Now, what I would like to think of is this diagram moving from left to right, and it's moving from previous historical times to now. And the idea is that we've moved on from wood and coal, so these are solid materials. We've gone through liquid fuels, crude oil going on to gasoline, diesel, and kerosene. We've then moved on to natural gas. And as we're doing this transition from solid and wood and coal and crude oil to natural gas, we're gradually increasing the relative amounts of hydrogen to carbon. Now, ultimately, we don't want any carbon there. And so hydrogen is sort of the end of this chain. It's a gas, so there are issues in how we manage a gas compared to liquids or solids. Nevertheless, there have in principle, there's a low carbon or zero carbon feature to hydrogen, especially at point of use. And so we're moving into a world which will have hydrogen as a significant element of the of energy transfer or storage allied with electricity. So hydrogen's not going to do everything. It'll stand alongside electricity. And of course, there are other variations to this, for example, biofuels. My own personal view is that biofuels still contain carbon, even if you would claim that it's recycled by um, the carbon cycle by going back into plants and animals. However, that cycle still has some issues attached to it. So I think that um, uh, my personal view is complete decarbonisation is a real significant option here. So what are the challenges? Well, there are quite a few. To my mind, at the moment, the main one I think is, well, we need to make a lot of carbon at scale, and we need to have someone to use it. Someone's not going to make hydrogen unless they can sell it, unless it can be used, and that cycle hasn't yet matured enough for people to start to be confident of making lots of hydrogen and with guaranteed people to buy it, off-takers, so-called off-takers, people who use it. So that really needs to be resolved, but there's a momentum gathering with making hydrogen at scale as the technology and the public acceptance, policy acceptance starts to become more positive. In terms of other challenges, how hydrogen integrates with other networks, other systems, gas system, natural gas, electricity system, the transport system, water. I mentioned that hydrogen by electrolyzing water is probably going to be the main route in the future of making hydrogen. Is there enough water around? Is it got the right quality to make sure that you make decent amounts of hydrogen without having lots of other things to do? And there are other challenges related to the business models. And also, the government we have this 2050 net zero target, but life won't stop at 2050. We'll have to keep the ball rolling after 2050. And not a lot of people think about how we're going to maintain and keep the energy system going post 2050 to make sure we don't creep back into a carbon economy. And there are initiatives in the UK for so-called clean power, clean electricity by 2030. So there are sort of interim targets we have to meet as well as net zero. So what are the opportunities? Well, hydrogen and maybe ammonia and related carriers can definitely support our journey towards secure net zero. It can buffer intermittent renewable electricity, and the idea there is that, of course, the sun doesn't always shine or the wind doesn't always blow, and so you can with they're not always matched to demand. So when you have an excess of electricity during the day, for example, from solar, you can store that excess in hydrogen and deliver that later on when the demand becomes high in the evenings. You can also do this at longer timescales, over seasons or even over annual periods. And of course, you can use the hydrogen not only for recycling back as electricity, but you can all use it in transport applications, in heating. There's a complete myth that hydrogen and heat pumps are it's either one or the other. Heating will almost certainly be a mixture of the two. Heating by heat pumps in some circumstances, heating by hydrogen boilers in others. And I'll push back hard on the claim that somehow heat pumps will be our only source of heating. And as a chemical engineer, I'm very interested in hydrogen being used as a replacement for fossil feedstocks into making chemicals, ammonia, pharmaceuticals, healthcare products, and so on. And whenever you have new technology, I'm very positive about boosting the economy as we move away from declining and polluting fossil fuels and feedstocks. So new tech is always expensive, it's always a challenge, and we have to make sure that we are sensible about its implications and managing its safety and so on. But in effect, I come right back to the beginning of my presentation. We're trying to protect the planet. And so while there are ripples in the road, ripples in the bumps in the road, I'm pretty confident that we have the way. We now need the will to be able to implement hydrogen technologies to help us protect the planet. So finally, I've been working on hydrogen projects for over 20 years now. One of my current projects is GW Shift, and I'm intensely happy and proud to be involved in that project, working with Karen and Jean-Lee at Exeter and others around the Southwest and South Wales. But I'm also involved in other hydrogen projects in the UK, and I have been in the past. And I have worked with wonderful, wonderful people and fantastic partners over these years. It's been an absolute privilege for me to be involved in these kind of activities. So my final statement, my last word is that over 20 years now, Nature, probably the leading scientific journal in the world, and I'll read it out. Hydrogen as a widely used energy carrier is essential and inevitable. Hear, hear. Scientists, technologists, governments, and philanthropists should do much more to hasten its arrival. That was over 20 years ago. We're now at a position that we do need to turn these concepts and scale up the hydrogen technology to help us achieve secure net zero. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was an enlightening and very accessible presentation. And I think a lot of people will have got an awful lot from that. Every time I do hear this, I always learn something new. So thank you very much for that presentation. We do have quite a few questions, but we don't have an awful lot of time. So I'll put a few questions to you, and then the others that we haven't been able to get to, maybe we can get an answer and put that out with the slides, etc. So first of all, can you give a general idea of the cost to produce a kilogram of H2O for current proven processes, please?
It'll be H2, not H2O.
H2, sorry.
Yeah, the price is a movable feast, but it's well over £10 per kilogram, which is unsustainable in terms of a consumer. So, as I mentioned in the slide I mentioned about challenges, we need to be able to um, reduce the cost per kilogram of hydrogen. And in America, they have this $1 per kilogram objective. I think that's quite challenging. But I can't see this price being reduced without some kind of government intervention, for example, subsidies. But let's face it, photovoltaics was subsidized heavily. Oil and gas has been subsidized heavily. I see no reason why hydrogen shouldn't be also the beneficiary of government investment. But eventually, technology will, as it matures and develops and is optimized, the cost will go down. So I came clean and said that hydrogen is expensive, much more expensive, for example, than the methane natural gas used to make it currently. So it is pricey. Government intervention could help. As technology develops, the price will go down. But can we afford not to use hydrogen and other renewable technologies to help us achieve net zero? I think that we are obliged to protect the planet to deliver these kinds of solutions. So yes, it's pricey, but I think the price will come down as we have better tech and government support.
Thank you. So how do you see hydrogen's role in decarbonising heating for the built environment?
Yes, this is a highly disputed area. A lot of people seem to think, or a lot of people claim, that heat pumps are our only option in replacing natural gas boilers to heat buildings, whether it's um, public buildings or private houses. However, hydrogen boilers are perfectly satisfactory ways of delivering heat to people's houses or industrial businesses or hospitals or churches or schools or universities. The technology is well understood. Either a mixed gas boiler with hydrogen and natural gas or a pure hydrogen boiler, they work perfectly well. And in certain environments, a heat pump definitely would be an advantage or an easy option. For example, in a nice semi-detached house out in a rural area where you have space in your garden to be able to put in a heat pump. But what happens if you live in a block of flats in the middle of a city or on grade two buildings? It's not always easy to for a heat pump to be installed or developed. There are ways of doing it, but it's not as easy as you think. However, a lot of these buildings in the inner cities are connected to the gas grid, and if hydrogen were blended, so-called blended into the natural gas grid, that would introduce hydrogen into a gas boiler to generate hot water and heating, and would replace, if you displace natural gas entirely, would be a pretty benign way of heating buildings, provided you make the hydrogen sustainably. When you use hydrogen to generate heat or electricity, it only produces water, but you do also need to think of whatever carbon is produced by making it in the first place. So it's not a simple calculation. So heating is an issue. I will push back against the idea that it's either or. It's and heat pumps and hydrogen.
Thank you. Somebody has said, I wanted to ask how logical, I think it means, is it to consume energy, electricity from wind energy for hydrogen production, and then use this hydrogen again to generate energy?
I think the key is right at the beginning of my talk. I mentioned that the key is that and I mentioned this at the end as well, that the renewable power that we are looking forward to, wind, solar, and others, are intermittent. They don't always match demand. And there are periods where the production of wind energy or solar energy exceeds demand. So you have an excess. Now, at the moment, that electricity is wasted essentially by heating up the power grid. However, if you could then use that excess electricity to generate hydrogen, you store the hydrogen away and use it later on where the demand exceeds production. For example, an easy model is solar energy. The sun doesn't shine at night, but you would like to be able, you do use energy for heating and for all sorts of things in the evening. And so you can then use the hydrogen on a daily basis. You could also use hydrogen on a seasonal basis by exploiting the excess of demand over the summer compared to the winter. So the idea of hydrogen originally, the key that made people excited is it's storing energy to be used when you have a deficit of the supply of intermittent renewable electricity, um, solar, wind, and whatever. But in fact, what's happening is people are also seeing other options for exploiting hydrogen in other sectors other than to produce power. So yes, you might argue that if I just wanted to go to electricity, hydrogen, and then go back to electricity again instantaneously, it'd be a waste of time, literally. But if you store it and move it around, um, you have, like I said, hydrogen is potentially easier to store than electricity. You don't have discharging so much. It's a little bit oversimplification, but that's a general position. So yes, it wouldn't make any sense if you did it without moving it to another place or moving it to another time. So, but I have tried to make the case that there are other benefits and options with hydrogen in addition to electricity generation.
Thank you, Tim. We do have a lot of questions, but I think we've probably just got time for one more before I just share a little bit information on how companies and organizations can get involved with the GW Shift program. So what do you think are the tipping point will be for the switch in focus from using electricity for transport to hydrogen, especially buses and HGVs?
Yes, that's a very interesting question because hydrogen was originally mooted as a replacement for gasoline in light-duty road vehicles, passenger vehicles on the road. Batteries appear to have won the day at the moment, and however, there is a view that the supply of materials to make batteries and to recycle them and their safety management have not been dealt with as effectively as they could do. So hydrogen is sort of coming back a little bit as a potential fuel for light duty road vehicles, though it's got an uphill struggle against the battery sector. Um, However, large vehicles like buses, trains, coaches, aircraft, batteries are not really an option in many cases because they're you need massive batteries to be able to drive a forklift truck or a bigger vehicle like a train or a bus or a ship or an aircraft. And so hydrogen really will be one of our main options to be able to have low carbon mobility in these sort of heavy duty sectors. And when you say tipping point, and this is always a tricky one, I can't point to a point in time. However, my view is if it becomes clear that we're starting to miss our carbon emission targets, there'll be significant government pressure in order to invest in technology and implement technology in order to both to mitigate that problem. And that's where I think that at the moment I can't deny hydrogen's not really out there at scale. And I think that will be start to become so there'll be sort of political pressure and there'll be consumer pressure as well, because I think the consumers are becoming more aware of their emissions profile and the effect on our climate. And they hear of things like the fires in California and floods in the UK as becoming a real life impact of climate change rather than something over there. And that together means that I think in the next 10 or 15 years, there, so rather than a tipping point, it'll be a tipping period.
I think you're right there. And I can see how government pressure is going to come. Hopefully, not in the too distant future because we need it now, really. So, thank you very, very much, Tim. I just want to, in the last minutes that we have today, to share some slides with you, just a couple to talk about how you can get involved and actually be able to use some of the technologies and getting hydrogen out there. So let me just share my slides. So there's a number of opportunities that we have in GW Shift. The funding is with the universities, but there is the opportunity to have secondments either into academia or out of academia. There are some larger high impact projects, and there are these sprint projects. We already have a number up and running, but we're looking for more collaborators on those projects. And also, particularly for SMEs and larger corporate, collaborative R&D grant funding. If you're interested, let us know. On these slides, which we will be sharing, there is the contact for gwshift@bath.ac.uk. You can also go to the website and to our LinkedIn page. And then just finally, I mentioned that this was a seminar series. We have a number of events coming up, hopefully equally as accessible as the great presentation we've had today from Tim May, that will be exploring hydrogen production, storage, hydrogen as the offshore renewable energy integration, industrial feedstocks, and hydrogen to ammonia and its uses, which we have talked about. Tim has talked about a little bit today as well. There will be 3 more in this series. So there'll be one in July, date in July, and then in October and November. If you do sign up to all of them and attend, then you will get a certificate of attendance at the end. And then finally, we have a few more events happening very soon. So one on decarbonising transport, somebody asked about that, on next week on Tuesday. We also have some events from Maritime UK Southwest, one around funding, which is the Clean Maritime Demonstrator Competition round, and we can help support you with that. We've got a webinar series around some of these where we'll have a panel talking about some of these issues that you've raised in the question. And also, finally, not the last, but the most important probably, how you can use some of this interdisciplinary research to make a difference. And this will give you an opportunity to meet with some of the leading researchers in this space in Bath on the 12th and 13th of March. We will share all these with you so that you can sign up, and we will get that information to you. I'm just going to stop sharing, and I thank you all for joining us today. It's been a pleasure, and we will be following up. Please give us feedback on these seminar series because we want to make them accessible and useful for all of you. So with no further ado, have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Thank you.